Welcome back to Foreign Policy. I'm Behnam Ben Taleblu, Senior Director of the Iran program here at the FDD think tank in Washington, D.C. Joining me virtually also from snowy Washington is the one and only Norman Roule. Norman was most recently the National Intelligence Manager for Iran at the DNI and has a 3+ decade long distinguished history working as a senior intelligence official in the U.S. intelligence community. Norm, it's a real pleasure to be able to share the virtual stage with you today. Thank you for joining us on Foreign Policy, and thank you for dealing with a poor substitute for the president and founder of FDD and the one who normally runs this podcast, the one and only Cliff May.
It's my pleasure to be here. It's always an honor to speak with FDD. And Behnam, I always learn a lot from you, as everyone does in Washington whenever you speak. So it's a pleasure to be with you today.
Honor. Thank you so much. Now that we've gotten the customary true taroffs out of the way, let's get to the heart of the matter. You can't open a newspaper, tweet, a video file, a story online without seeing reference to this changing pattern of Gen Z, youth, women in Iran really pushing up against the barrier in terms of something that they've long suffered from, which is this mandatory hijab. What do you have to say about this change, this kind of social political change in the Islamic Republic? Is it social and political? There's a lot of people who have a very short attention span in Washington and have kind of strung together a series of these very interesting images and videos coming out of Tehran, showing the youth, showing the best, showing the brightest, showing the women, and kind of using this to paint an altogether different political story. When you look at those images and when you look at those videos and you read those stories, what jumps off the page at you, and what message do you think Americans and American policymakers should be taking from those stories and from those images?
Policymakers should approach this with caution. Social media stories have no metric to them. It's difficult to say how many people are involved, what geography is involved, what time frame is involved, exactly how the regime responded to such events in those with those characteristics. Therefore, if you're a policymaker, you've got to decide: does this represent real change, or does this represent an incident or a series of incidents or something that happened in a certain locale that doesn't actually mean anything for regime policy? And even if it does mean actual change is occurring in Iran society, what does that mean in terms of the policies that matter the most for the United States and for Iran's neighbors? For example, there may be less emphasis on the use of hijab in Iran. Today, Iran is firing a series of missiles in the Gulf. Today, Iran's Quds Force is still operating. Today, Iran has still hundreds, if not thousands, of people in prison. So you've got to balance that against the issues that really do matter for policymakers. So it's a question of how much of this information is actually real, and a question of how much of this information matters on the issues that matter to policymakers.
I want to push you on the things that matter, because I really agree there's a style to a lot of what we see on social media, and then there's a substance. And with both the style and the substance, there's always some kind of a cropping effect or a clipping effect. I remember, I think just a few weeks ago, there was a little mini outdoor public concert that was tolerated in Tehran on social media. And, there was a couple of folks swinging and swaying and a couple of headbanging and just, listening to rock music. I don't know if it was Vampire Weekend or another band that the folks on the street were doing a cover of. I forgot. But that video went viral, and I saw tons of folks in the human rights community, in the Iran policy community, sharing it across the weekend on social media. And then allegedly, lo and behold, one or two of the accounts of the performers got frozen online. And then, through contacts of contacts, allegedly, one of the performers said to folks in the West, stop sharing it, because then they got in major trouble for it. So there's a lot that is really brimming beneath the surface when it comes to this kind of images or snapshots that we see in Iran? And should policymakers have to pay attention to that as well, to the full life cycle of them, or is it kind of best to ignore this altogether?
Well, they do, but it goes into the broader story. When you see a single image or a single video or a single series of videos, it doesn't really tell you anything. It may give a snapshot of a particular moment in time, but it's like a poll, a political poll. It doesn't really say anything. You need to look at a trend. You need to look at a vast amount of data. You then need to examine that data for its validity. In the intelligence community, we certainly wouldn't look at a social media posting and put any great emphasis on it as something that would predict a vast amount of social change in any country. We would take that as a piece of evidence to be considered, but it's a puzzle piece. But you need an awful lot of puzzle pieces to go somewhere. Now, the problem is there are entities in the West who want to believe something, and they then magnify a piece of social media to their audience. And there are people who want to believe what they want to believe, and then they magnify that accordingly, and it takes on a life of its own. But for policymakers, they have advisors who are meant to say, no, let's put this into perspective. And frankly, most policymakers won't be paying attention to that sort of data.
And what about some of the other things in the background that policymakers do pay attention to? You mentioned the IRGC naval drills. That's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy for our audience, going on in the Persian Gulf just now. That element of Iran's kind of transnational terrorist apparatus sat out the cycle of violence that we saw in the region, particularly the missile exchanges vis-a-vis the Iranians and the Israelis over the past couple of months now. Is there a particular message to some of the other things that we're seeing in the news, like these military drills, this IRGC Navy one, but also there was a pretty large-scale nationwide besiege one that kind of looked to me like, despite the regime being crippled and down but not out, or wounded, I should say, is probably a better word, after the 12-day war, the threat they seem to be worried about the most is the domestic threat, or at least the posturing that they seem to be trying to kind of get ready for is the domestic one.
Well, you're absolutely right. The regime is quite fragile. They are intensely unpopular. The number of voters who turned out for the last presidential election which was itself shaped to present a candidate, Pezeshkian, who was designed to be the most attractive to the electorate, came out was a historic low. They've had two vice presidents fired. They've had a finance minister impeached since that time, and he left talking about the millions of Iranians who have descended into poverty since in the last few years. The Iranians are facing a historic drought for which mismanagement over a series of administrations have left them with no policy options. And the result is that you have a government that has no alternative but to crack down on its population. So if you're looking at sort of a story and a counter story that play well against each other. A good example would be the Iranians saying, we're interested in negotiations with the West because we want to be peaceful. And then they have a massive military maneuver in the Gulf when they're firing an unprecedented number of missiles. We're interested in freedom for our people, and more women are showing their hair and there are bands playing. And we're doing a massive crackdown with 21,000 people arrested and expedited executions, et cetera, et cetera. So, it is a series of videos on bands playing and women without hijabs. Does that really have the same weight as 21,000 arrests and executions? Does a few messages on interest in negotiations without any actual significant compromises up front carry the same weight as missile firings at the same time? And if you're looking for actual indicators of change, that ain't it. We've also had reports of weapons smuggling throughout the region in the last few weeks. So if you're looking for proof that Iran is trying to show that it's interested in change, sending weapons to terrorists, militias, firing missiles, cracking down on its people, arresting people, and expediting executions, I would put that in the list of things aren't changing despite some happy dancing and hijab-free afternoons.
And you put that definitely at the top of the list. It sounds like, right? Those would be the real measures of substantive change.
Well, if you're the president of the United States or regional leaders, or if you're looking for evidence of change in the government that really shows that the regime is interested in change, you're going to look for structural shifts that indicate the regime is moving personnel or structures that touch long-standing equities. I mean, just a simple example: they are having a profound water challenges, and they need additional resources. Well, is this the week you'd waste money on missile firings? You know, I could see someone coming up with an announcement to say, we're going to curtail some of our military firings this year and put the money instead into water programs for the impoverished people of Iran. I mean, that's a policy decision that shows you, where you put your money is where your priorities happen to be. Well, their priorities happen to be with the Revolutionary Guard missile program. It's a simple fact. That's not propaganda for me. That's just a simple fact. The 5 dams around Tehran that are at a historic low, that's a simple fact. And what they're doing about that is firing missiles in the Persian Gulf.
So it seems like, despite all these things, this kaleidoscope of images that have come our way post 12-day war, economic, environmental, social, I'm kind of reminded of a candy coating of an M&M or something like that, where the shell is broken, but that core remains kind of precisely the same. And I want to ask you, you've been watching Iran for so long. There have been some stylistic changes before. The Islamic Republic of 2015 certainly is not like the Islamic Republic of 1985, both in terms of state and society. But looking at that core and the things that have kind of remained constant, what are you, as someone who has served decades in the U.S. government, most worried about those constants? And is that really have more to do with us and what we should be paying attention to versus what we're missing, versus things that those guys are able to still pursue despite some of the setbacks, be they economic, environmental, or certainly military, post 12-day war?
I think you need to approach this 2 ways. First, with some humility. We live in a country where we're often asked, who will be the next president of the United States? And people say, how the heck do I know? Now, we live in a country where there is a vast amount of data and polling, and people talk about this all the time, and you can go to the newspapers and Google, and it's all of this data. And our answer is, we don't really know. But to ask how events will go in Iran, which is, in essence, a very difficult to understand environment, people will sometimes make some fairly assertive predictions. And what I've always admired about you and your just consistently brilliant analysis, and I'm not playing my audience, you are truly one of the wisest people on the Iranian issue that I've known. You need to have some humility as to how we approach this issue. So I'm going to be upfront and say, I want to be careful how we talk about this. Now, this said, the trends for almost 20 years have been quite clear. Iran's political direction has moved with a constant trend line of towards a conservative direction. Individuals generally drawn from the Revolutionary Guard with a worldview that has been shaped by events since 2003, less and less over time from the revolutionary generation and the Iran-Iraq War have dominated Iran's political elite. They are often interrelated in terms of how they deal with each other in terms of business equities, political equities, professional equities. And this system, the Nizam, is often self-supporting, and therefore the system itself is self-sustaining. So when you look at what happens after the supreme leader leaves, it's not very difficult to suggest that what you're going to see is a bit more of the same, maybe with a different flavor. So in some ways, it's like looking at a Rubik's Cube. You can describe a Rubik's Cube as a lot of little dots, or maybe how you want to look at it, but at the end of the day, it's a cube. So if you're the president of the United States, you deal with cubes or balls or triangles. You're dealing with really big country issues. You want to think, how does this country fit into a region of Saudi Arabia or the Emirates or China or Russia? You really don't care about the smaller issues because you're the president. You only have so much time to deal with things. And therefore, the biggest issues we deal with Iran are terrorism, missile proliferation, energy policy, the major human rights issues. You don't see Iran changing its direction over the years. Nuclear policy, you see a constant trend line as to how it treats these issues. And therefore, when it puts forward a candidate such as President Rouhani or President Pezeshkian, there are rhetorical shifts. There are promises of some sort of change in that direction. There are even temporary pauses, such as the Iranian nuclear deal, which, whether you're for or against it, did put a freeze on Iran's nuclear program for a certain period of time. But it didn't end that program. It didn't deny Iran the capacity to build a nuclear weapon forever. And therefore, it shows that the direction is unchanging. So it's a fairly easy thing to say that Iran's direction since 2003 has been a constant, with the humility that I hopefully conveyed with my initial comment.
It was very well conveyed, and also very kind of you to mention my analysis. I've learned from greats like you and many of your colleagues who've kind of come out of government over the years, but you've really been a North Star for a lot of the open source Iran Watcher community. And following those trend lines, I've become a little bit unpopular among some friends and colleagues and folks in Washington, because it's entirely possible amid all this conversation of change that if we don't have, this is just my 2 cents, and I'd love your thoughts on this before we get to something that has left the president's desk recently, the US president's desk, and that is, it is totally possible for mediocrity to limp along unless there really is a national revolution or a street pushback against the state that is successful, or a mass defection by the security services, or another exogenous shock like a combination military strike, environmental catastrophe, economic. Absent all of these exogenous shocks, it is totally possible for just another mediocre elderly cleric to try to ride the wave of crackdowns and, being content with the Islamic Republic becoming a semi-failed state where, to quote someone else in Washington, Mike Duran, where the regime remains lord of the rubble because they're the only sovereign in town. Is that something that you should be, that is plausible, and that also, we who look at what may come after Khamenei need to seriously grapple with?
In the near term, that is the most likely outcome. In the medium term, it becomes challenged by events that are taking place across the Gulf in the Arabian Peninsula. The Saudi and Emirati social and economic experiments are dramatically transforming their economies based on a weird science of energy, chemicals, artificial intelligence, finance, and very focused social policies. And it's dramatically changing the societies themselves and their economies and taking them light years ahead of where their economies and societies were just a decade ago, socially, as well as the lifestyles that these people enjoy. Now, as that progression continues, that progression is going to be developing exponentially. So Iran is going to not just fall farther and farther behind, but that backwardness is going to become more pronounced more rapidly as time goes along. I mean, you're looking at the chip deals and the investments that are talked about with the recent visit of the Saudi Crown Prince and the Emirati ministers and the Qataris and others have been to the United States. I mean, Iran is not enjoying any of this. So just imagine 5 years of this, 3 years of this in the Gulf, what this would bring to the a standard of living and the social world of the Gulf, with the foreign presence, the multicultural and multi-faith presence that this invites into the Gulf, which is being invited by the Saudi and Emirati and other governments to promote their business environments. And Iran has none of this. I think that is a pressure that the regime has never seen in the past. And of all of the threats that the regime faces, I think that is the most dangerous and sort of an unsustainable threat the regime will ever encounter.
Well, that is a profound statement. I just want to footnote that and kind of repackage it one more time. So, because our audience really should notice the status discrepancy that the UAE and the Saudi kind of social and political and the nature of governance and the nature of society and the nature of business that their leaders have been able to affect might well end up being one of the greatest drivers or greatest vectors of pressure against the Islamic Republic's ruling elite. That gap between the haves and the have-nots, the gap between what we are versus what we could be. Iranians who, for better or worse, routinely look at what the UAE was in 1970 versus what it is today. For better or worse, who look at the value of their rial in 1970 versus what it is today. For better or worse, look at the accessibility their passport bought them from 1970 or today. Or tons of them who were never around, but just see it or glean it from what they hear from their parents or grandparents or social media or documentaries or YouTube videos, for good or for ill. That status discrepancy with the closest neighbors, who, to be brutally honest, Iranians have often looked down on, might well end up being one of the biggest drivers of change. Did I package that correctly?
You did. And if anything, you may have understated it, because that change is about to be supercharged by the arrival of the highly advanced chips that the United States is about to provide, primarily Saudi Arabia and the Emirates in the quantities. Other countries may receive these, but not in the quantities of the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. And that will give these economies a very special role in the world. So if you look, for example, at the recent Saudi Arabia Future Investment Initiative, they had 20 world leaders, as they put it, come to their country. Now, if you looked at the Emirati oil and artificial intelligence event that took place, they had 280,000 people show up and $46 billion in deals. Now, compare this with the Iranian African Commercial Summit that took place just some months before, which had a dwindling number of African attendees and a very, very modest number of, well, we might do some economic engagement with Africa. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So the Emirates is now the largest investor in Africa. And the Emirates, I mean, how many Emiratis are there? How many Iranians are there? This is something is happening here. And it's just going to take on a very different life of its own. And we're watching an entertainment in the Gulf take on a very different life. And now, so you see a few concerts happening in the Emirates, or rather in Iran, but really compare that to what's taking place in Saudi Arabia, which was once quite a conservative society on its own. So I think this pressure in itself is going to form a very different wave that the Iran's leadership in coming years is going to need to confront with its youth population, that will not be sustained by the ideology of the revolution. In some ways, this is the dying days of the Soviet Union, where even its most ardent supporters, they're not standing up supporting the days of Lenin and Kronstadt and Petrograd and so forth. Nobody believes in that anymore. Well, who believes in 1979 in Iran? Which countries in the Middle East stand up and say, we want to live as well as the people of Tehran. We want the Iranian Revolution in our country. Unless you're a militia, and looking for some guns. You don't really tap that. But how many people wake up in the morning and say, I want to move to the Arabian Peninsula? How many people around the world say, I want to move to the Arabian Peninsula and work? Well, that's going to be a pressure the Iranians are going to have to endure. And the Iranian government is going to have quite a challenge. I think that will be quite a corrosive on the regime.
That is real food for thought.
And I think you may want to even measure maybe how if dancing, if entertainment in the Gulf now produces a little bit of whisper of entertainment in Iran, what other aspects of life across the Gulf might see whispers in Iran that the Iranian regime tries to emulate to show that some of that takes place here? I'm not suggesting that emulation, that the Gulf is a source of emulation. I'm sorry for the pun, but and I mean no heresy by that. But or blasphemy by that. But I mean, but Iran itself needs to consider how it provides its people with an outlet to replicate what it might see in the Gulf, because the distances are so short, and that people travel back and forth to Dubai and to Oman and to Kuwait and elsewhere.
Forgive me, sir. I lied. I said I was going to go to a question from the president's desk, but this is just a tie-on to what you just said. And because, again, I think it really is profound, and it's something that we don't discuss here in Washington. And even though it sounds like it's a soft issue, it really has major political weight to it. People dancing, social life in the Arabian Peninsula, the quality of the AI revolution going on one side of the Persian Gulf versus the, amount of technological backwardness on the other side. I want to ask this in some, acute way that has to do more with affairs of the head, more with affairs of the heart than the head. And I'm putting my cards on the table here as a proud first generation Iranian American. Will Iran just be left behind if this is the case? And in a post-Khamenei world where the thesis that you and I said is probably, given the trend lines, unless there's an exogenous shock, be it revolution or strike or some kind of, again, exogenous shock, and mediocrity post-Khamenei replicates itself, isn't one of the lessons there just to be able to take a little bit from the other side and give it to the population? And why I'm asking, and perhaps I'm not phrasing it correctly, but let me begin by saying it this way. In Persian, we have a saying which is "Bemarg begir ke be tab razi boshan." Take them at death so they're content with a fever. If the next generation of the Islamic Republic's leadership gets to the point where they are the next generation, and they sense the cost of this status discrepancy, isn't one way that they might be able to thwart a commensurate political revolution against them is by bringing in some more of those social and cultural openings that already exist in spades, coming from a more conservative society on the opposite side of the Persian Gulf? Might this actually be able to be a tool to lock themselves in, to kind of distract the population and give them something that they become so content with, that they've been so starved for so long, which is personal and social freedom?
Well, to just stretch, perhaps inappropriately, the comparison to the Soviet Union, that's exactly what the Soviets did. They developed their own version of rock and roll. They developed their version of jazz. They developed their version of a variety of things to replicate what they saw in the West, and they tried to provide this to their people to say, if they can do it, we can do this here. Autocratic regime, fascist regimes do this. The Nazis did it in the Second World War. Charlie and his orchestra. This is not uncommon, but it's not the same thing. It's not going to be the same thing. And the magnificent Iranian people with their extraordinary history are already behind compared to the region, much as the extraordinary East European people were behind the extraordinary West European people in 1989. But they caught up rather quickly once the wall fell. Much as when the Islamic Republic disappears, things will change rather quickly, I'm sure. But there is quite a difference. Was quite a difference between East Germany and West Germany in 1989, and that's just a hard reality. And there is a really tough difference right now between life in Tehran or life in Esfahan and life in Jeddah and Sharjah and these cities. I mean, it's just a reality. But the regime itself will need to come up with some version of this. But I see that after the supreme leader, when you have a post revolutionary generation, which is now trying to show we're a little different. We are more engaging, but that also falls in a realm where they could become in a new transformation, something similar to the Russians, where they become maybe something like a Putin type of Russia. There are various evolutionary developments that could occur in Iran itself, but that's again difficult to predict.
I want to pursue that rabbit hole, but you touched that word that I love to rhyme with, which is evolution, devolution, or revolution. And it's possible that you proceed towards one and then non-linearly proceed or fall into another. I mean, it is going to be very difficult, I think, to predict. But those are some very important trend lines you gave us, particularly that status discrepancy, which again I would footnote and footstomp.
And your work, everybody should read your work. And you should be writing the indicators of all three, and everybody should be following the work that you do, and FDD writes and others do this.
That's a charge for me to write more. But now to policy, now to the president's desk. Just recently, there's a document that you're very familiar with, having spent lots of years in government, having it impact you, which is the national security strategy. There's a new national security strategy out that, if you control F, only mentions Iran 5 times. And the first 2 times are actually just in the introduction. And the other 3 times when Iran is dealt with in substance, it's almost kind of passively dealt with, as in a nuclear threat, a potential proliferation threat that has been or dealt with, and that the U.S. remains ready to deal with should it reconstitute itself again.
And terrorism.
Is this, by your measure, sufficient treatment of the Iran threat, insufficient treatment, or is this just the right amount?
It is consistent with the Trump administration's foreign policy since the initiation of the Trump administration. The Trump administration's foreign policy in the Middle East has been terrifically predictive and, as I say, quite consistent. That policy has had a number of pillars, which have included no interest in engaging the United States in conventional conflict in the Middle East, willingness to use surgical military action to either halt Iran's pursuit of a nuclear weapon or Iran's engagement in terrorist activity against the United States, provision of military equipment to partners to enable them to defend themselves or engage in short-term military activity, offensive activity against Iran's proxies to defeat those proxies, and then to focus primarily upon diplomacy, relentless diplomacy, to use a phrase from the previous administration, with anybody, to include the Iranians before and after military activity, and Iran's proxies, Hamas, for example, and then to engage in transformational trade. Those pillars have been consistent throughout all of the Trump administration's engagement. That's pretty much what you see in the national security policy. And in theory, the approach to the Iranians has been just that. I would add one more piece of that with Iran, which is not wasting time. And that's been a challenge for the Iranian government because they are used to using time wasting as a powerful tool of their foreign policy. Because the nuclear program and Iran's offensive foreign policy tools, the Quds Force, have become sort of a shield and a sword. They've each sort of maybe shifted in that role every once in a while, but primarily the nuclear program has served as a shield of the sword of the Quds Force. Iran has generally developed a gradually expanding nuclear program up to the point of 60% enrichment, which is a military and grade program, which was a casus belli. It was a red line for the U.S. government and others for many years. You would have certainly thought. And then anytime anyone approached them on Quds Force activity, missile activity, any other human rights activity, Iranian negotiators would say, don't press us on this or it will cause people to go the last X yards on the nuclear program itself. And if you wanted to press them on those other actions, Europeans and others would say, we really can't, because if you do, it might cause them to move to the last few yards of the nuclear program. The Trump administration, through its use of military activity on Iran's nuclear program, not only fulfilled multiple presidents' statements, all options are on the table, and proved that you could conduct a military campaign without a region-wide war, proving many people wrong. Then going to the Iranians saying, we will talk to you if you're serious about negotiations. Also told them, we're not going to waste time to you if you're not going to be serious about negotiations. And here's why that's important. If Iran comes to the table and they're not serious about negotiations, the actual act of negotiating with the United States automatically strengthens the regime. It raises the rial. As soon as negotiations begin, usually the sense of hope, the perception, the rial becomes stronger. The stock market in Iran improves. The regime is stronger the day it begins talks with the United States because people say, talks are beginning. The regime then says, almost inevitably, we think talks are going well. The United States generally will say, talks seem to be moving in the right direction. We're trying to encourage the talks. And then talks take on, some sort of life of their own because diplomatic talks are usually slow. They're complicated. These are difficult issues. Iran inevitably uses intermediaries because that's the Iranian approach to talks. That inherently slows the talks down. That buys time. That allows the talks not only to be lengthened, but it allows them to bring in intermediaries who in themselves defend the talks. That breaks coalitions. That invites a partner who himself becomes invested in the success of the talks. So that's part of the process. And then if the talks fail, the Iranians are able to tell the world, well, we were trying to undertake talks, and then the United States pulled out, and what are you going to do to the crazy Americans? Now, they'll omit the fact that while talks were taking place, they were undertaking terrorism, they were expanding their nuclear program, they were bombing people, et cetera, et cetera. But that is what the Iranian tactics have been. I think the Trump administration has been quite wise in not approaching talks if the talks are going to be a waste of time. And there are other reasons for that, ranging from serious talks require serious people. And you only have, in any administration, so many serious people. And any administration, this one included.
Footnote, by serious, you mean they have the trust of the president and the capability to deliver on the portfolio? Their
stature, the rank, there's just a certain number of senior people. And these senior people usually have a number of jobs. Russia, China, Venezuela, there's always another crisis in the world going on. Palestinian issues, Gaza, there's always something else in the world. So if you're going to undertake talks with Iran, you're pulling someone away from something else. So if you're in the White House and someone says, I want you to start talks with Iran, that conversation also says, and you're going to stop doing something else. So that conversation should have in it, because these talks are going to succeed because of X, and therefore it's more important that you stop doing something else. The challenge is in Washington and other places, there is a polity that believes even if there's no evidence that talks will go anywhere, you should be talking. And that's an audience, and I'm not going to put a value judgment on it. I'm just going to point out that there's a price for that. They exist. They're the ones who say, because the Trump administration isn't talking to Iran, it's doing something bad. That's wrong. But that is an argument that people do make. It is more correct to say the Trump administration shouldn't waste time on feckless diplomacy. The Trump administration should only engage in diplomacy when it has a reason to believe that diplomacy would be successful. And I think the administration's use of intermediaries is appropriate because these countries don't have the same necessary responsibilities that we do in other parts of the world. And if they see an opening or an opportunity, they're able to carry that message to the White House and say, the Iranians are able to do this. Now, let me circle around and say, if the Iranians are sincere about negotiations, just as if they're sincere about providing their people with water, you would think they wouldn't be firing missiles in the Gulf today. You would think that they wouldn't be sending weapons to Gaza today and the Houthis today and the Sudanese government today. You would think that they would say, we're going to turn the Quds force into a counterterrorism force. If you wanted to see a genuine structural change in Iran, a genuine change that would tell you Iran is moving in the right direction, it would be the Quds force is no longer going to be exporting revolution. If you saw that change and it was real, you would say, that is a sign that the regime itself is transforming into a normalized state structure. But as long as it has a body that exports missiles, terrorists, and militias, it's going to be a problem.
But the transformation, both in your answer and to the, I promise I don't normally reference a number of times a word appears in a speech or a statement or a document, but the transformation really does seem to be within America and within the Trump administration itself, as in the consistency is the transformation that the president promised moving away from the region. He's trying to deliver. The president promised, right-sizing Middle Eastern commitments. He's delivering. The president promised not getting stuck in some of these conflicts in the region. He seems to be delivering. And I mean this with immense respect, the untetheredness that the president has to the political and the moral groupings behind everything in the dime world, diplomacy, information or intelligence, military, economic. I think for the first time that I've been looking at this problem set, and obviously just as a student to think tank world now, so much smaller period in time, we really do have a president who is all options on the table and isn't politically persuaded towards one option because of politics or because of a certain value judgment about that option. And I think that leaves us in a powerful position should we choose to lead Iran policy in a certain direction. But otherwise, I think that can also leave us in the situation that I fear now moving into 2026, where we are the ones who are highly responsive to external stimuli because we're not going to sink the capital to pull someone from one file into something else. We're just going to kind of set the pieces and have Iran react. And in a world where Iran won't invest the political capital to react, they'll work through intermediaries, they won't change their behavior. We're going to be kind of in this world of, I don't want to say predictable, but in this world of known knowns, in the relative stasis. And I think there's an inherent comfortability by some folks in Washington and even within the administration, because, well, that means you don't have to sink time, resources, capital, assets to deal with this issue, because they have said, and as you rightly said, they have consistently said and demonstrated that they have other priorities.
Well, that's true. I hear the logic. I understand the logic, but I don't think that's occurring for a couple of reasons. First of all, I am rigidly nonpartisan. My whole career was telling policymakers often what they didn't necessarily want to hear. I mean, the State Department usually is for the good news. The intelligence community is usually for the bad news bear. Um, 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 but right now, we're in a place where Iran's nuclear weapons program, doesn't appear to exist for the first time since for 2 decades plus. Missiles and drones are not being fired. Knock on wood. This could change while we're speaking. For the first time in a very long time, the intensity of military action against U.S. forces is again among its lowest in a very long time. Arab and Israeli partners are coming to us. Transformational business opportunities are flooding to the United States, and American companies are being sought by every country in the region. Energy prices are as low as they've been since February 2021, and the market is predictable and steady. The Gaza war has ended. The Houthis haven't fired a missile at Israel since the ceasefire began. Iran's proxies are devastated. That is Syria is moving in the right direction. Lebanon is much more slowly moving in the right direction. And the president has consistently sent emissaries into Lebanon and Syria. And he has engaged regional actors on Oman, on Iran. Now, that's a fair amount of engagement. And likewise, if you put this paradigm of the regime itself as this engine of growth, of energy, of something that in and of itself is a pressure point against Iran itself, and that Iran's rot, its political rot, its economic rot, its demographic pressures and disillusionment, that's a power against the regime itself. I'm not sure what I would do if I were standing in front of the president saying, this is what I'd like you to do on Thursday at 3:00 that could accelerate things. And simply by saying, send Larry out to go talk to the Iranians, I'm not sure what that would do to change things. Whereas right now, these pressures seem to be moving things in the generally right direction. And the president's policies are consistent with, in general, with what the United States goals have been for the Middle East for, frankly, 20 years. This is what we've said we want, where we've wanted the Middle East to go. We don't want to be in a war. We've wanted this kind of paradigm. Read the national security statement on the Middle East today and ask yourself, how would this be something that Bill Clinton, George Bush 43, Obama, anybody would not want for the Middle East today? Just say, where would the disagreement be?
You mean the emphasis that the current one is putting on peace, prosperity, economic integration, diplomatic
trade, not being involved in wars. The difference might be, having to do with how we handle governance, leaving it to the regime itself. But for many years of my career, we used to say it's not up to the United States to tell other countries how to run themselves. That was routinely something I heard for the majority of much of my career. It just seemed to change a little bit towards the latter portion of my career. And I can assure you that whatever people think about how life is in a variety of countries, hundreds of thousands of people are moving to live in the Arabian Peninsula. So if people find life there so unpleasant, there are hundreds of thousands of people from many countries who are flooding into that country. And it's not just Elon Musk going there to make a lot of money. These are average people there to live with their families.
Yeah, I know quite a few Americans actually who have
Absolutely
relocated, and they're not trillionaires. Well, I want to, as we begin to have our conversation come to a close, thank you for your time and your generosity. But looking elsewhere, we've mentioned a lot of the GCC countries. We haven't mentioned a lot of America's, more traditional European partners who I think in this period of where I see the Trump administration getting all the big issues with Iran right, but me having some serious qualms about the human rights side, about the anti-corruption side, about where sanctions could be better and whatnot. That's where I actually see the major, revolution or evolution in terms of other Five Eyes countries. The Canadians have been leaders on things like transnational repression. The UK has been going after, a whole bunch of corrupt businessmen. The European Union moving in the right direction. The Australians designate Iran's press TV as a foreign agent. They finally designated the IRGC as a terrorist organization. In a world in which Uncle Sam keeps figuring out the big picture, the Europeans kind of seem to be filling in a little bit of the rest. Is this an okay enough formula to govern how we deal with both the threats and the opportunities coming out of Iran as we head into 2026? Or at some point, are we going to have a reckoning and pay greater attention to the details because the devil is in the details? Or is predict for us, if you don't mind, is the trend line the president said correct, and we can afford to stick to it because it's really only the big questions that get to his desk anyway?
Well, look at the rationale for the actions by these parties. What they have stated is last year or the previous year, there were terrorist activities or lethal activities conducted by the Iranian government in those countries, which merited sanctions or certain legal prohibitions against Iran. The president and the FBI and the U.S. intelligence community right now do not currently, or at least publicly, are not saying that those activities are taking place in the United States. And therefore, I'm going to presume, given the robust attention they pay to such things, that we don't have evidence of saying, because they have let the Iranians know the reaction would be pretty robust given what happened in June. And that these other countries are now responding to something that one can't help wondering that perhaps they might have known about in the past, but only feel that they feel politically enabled to respond to at present. And I'm again not trying to play with language here, but one can't help asking if perhaps they knew about these activities at some point in the past and why they didn't make these
corrections
what's known maybe at a different time in a different chronology for different actions. I would also say, what pressure does this actually bring on Iran itself? The fact that they remove an ambassador from Tehran, an Iranian ambassador from Australia, that there's some action against Iran for its action against Iran International in London. All this is appropriate. I'm not pushing back on any of it. But has this changed the direction of the regime? Do we think the supreme leader and the small group of people around him wake up in the morning and say, the Australians got rid of that ambassador in Canberra. Holy cow, we need to change our policy. I'm not denigrating or diminishing what our extraordinary allies in Australia do. I'm just asking the question, did that action change Iran's policy? Now, at the same time, did the U.S. destruction of Fordow change Iran's policy? I'm not saying every action should be at that level, but what are you trying to do? What is your goal? Are you trying to change a policy? Are you trying to send a message? What's the cost of one? What's the cost of other? And so it's not a bad thing that's happening. I just don't want to put them in the same pile of
equal weight.
Of equal weight. What the president of the United States did in June, and what the United States administration empowered Israel to do in June, is catastrophic for the regime. The Iranians lost a war in June. They lost it quickly. And it erased a red line of U.S. and Israeli military action against Iran that now is erased forever. The Iranians forever must wonder, will the U.S. or Israel conduct a military action against them in the future? And that's now a permanent, they don't know.
Have we successfully, and I'll bring the conversation to a close with this, and in some way, I wanted to avoid this because there really was so much to discuss with you, from Iran internal to the region to America to our allies. But you ended with the prospect of a expanded or a continued conflict. Has Washington successfully kind of flipped the sword of Damocles? They used to threaten widening or horizontal escalation against us. Now we kind of threaten the prospect of real and credible and impactful military action against them. Has the role really been reversed here? And are we headed to a potential conflict in 2026, a resumption of a hot war, potentially Israel-Iran or America-Iran?
Well, again, people who spend their time predicting the future, and when people are asked to do that, you should test them first by asking a lottery number, and please give it to me first and let me know a day in advance. But I will say this: you should ask first if there's going to be a war, what are the strategic drivers on each side? Will the United States, does the United States believe a war is in its interest in the Middle East, or Israel starting a war? Look at the national security strategy today. Does Iran believe it can survive a war against the United States, or just start a war against its Gulf neighbors? Why would Iran want to start a war against Israel? And these are just questions to ask. Put and create a list. What's the strategic? When people say finish the job, you sometimes hear this phrase. What is the job? Or change the regime? How do you define the word regime? Is it two people? What is the regime? If Iran's missiles are going to be fired against Israel, why do they think Israel is just going to sit there and take it and fight the same way they fought the last war? The United States didn't break a sweat when they devastated Iran. And the technology that was used against Iran can now be publicly stated. That technology was invented in 2004. Hypothetically, I don't want to give anything away. I think our military may have thunk up a few things in the last 21 years that Iran can't deal with. And Iran's military is not very advanced, but their military personnel are quite professional. And I respect them for their professional capacity to know that they are not able to compete against the United States. So as we're moving forward, what are the reasons that if you're in Tehran right now with this fragile regime that you would say, I think we should start a war with the United States? Or if you're in Washington or Israel, when you're trying to deal with Gaza, that your answer is, I think we should invite a conflict that creates a barrage of a few hundred missiles that we have to deal with and pay for their defense. These are just questions policymakers will ask. What's victory on the end of this? It's fun for people who are 6,000 miles away having a cup of coffee in a cafe or think tank or home to talk about this. But for the people who have to pay for this and be on the other end of those missiles and catch them, it's a hard conversation. But it's a conversation someone as smart as you and the people at FDD or United Against Nuclear Iran, and I also advise, can think about and provide the smart answers to. So thank you very much for having me today. And Behnam, as always, your questions are far more insightful than anything I could ever have to say.
No, it's a pleasure and honor, and thank you for sharing your time and wisdom with us. I certainly think there's a lot more room to continue the conversation, and perhaps there'll be opportunities in the next year for us to check in. But absolutely, again, thank you for your time and your wisdom, and a lot of food for thought on the ways, the means, and the ends for Middle East and Iran moving ahead. Norm Roule, thank you again.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this was an episode of Foreign Policy. I'm Behnam Ben Taleblu, honored to fill in for Clifford May. Ciao.